Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. A 23.5% rent increase was just approved in BC. We're going to talk about exactly what happened here, and we're also going to talk about short-term rentals and are they really impacting home prices across the country. Real quick, if this is your first time to the channel, my name is Hassan. I'm a real estate agent in the Vancouver area, and I make educational real estate content to help you on your real estate journey. When I'm not making videos like this, I'm helping people just like you buy and sell real estate across the lower mainland. So if that sounds interesting to you, you want to chat with me one-on-one about your real estate situation, you can book me for a free call in the Calendly link below and subscribe to this channel so you don't miss a future weekly video. All right, we're going to jump right into it. 23.5% rental increase approved in BC. Not across the board, only in one instance. So we're going to talk about exactly what happened here, what sort of effect this may have on other tenancies. If you're a landlord or a tenant, you're going to want to listen to this. So to give you the long and short of what happened here, we had two landlords. They purchased a multiplex, a fourplex, back in 2021. And obviously they purchased at a time where rates were quite low. They purchased on a variable rate. They got a variable rate mortgage. Their rate was at 1.9%. And so they purchased this multiplex, and I believe they had existing tenants in there paying, whatever their rents were, between $1,200 and $1,500 a month. And ultimately, as we all know, what happened with interest rates from that 2021 point through to 2023 is that rate that they were on, that variable rate, climbed, and they saw that rate go up considerably, the bank's rate at least going up to 5% at the time. And what they found with their mortgage payments, so these two landlords, is in that span of time, in a year, rather than spending, $45,000, that almost doubled. That went up to $80,000 in financing costs, strictly due to interest rates. Now, you might be thinking, why does any of this matter? If you've been following my channel, you know that we don't really have recourse when rates go up. If you're a landlord, your financing costs are your problem. You deal with them and you move forward. And here in BC, we have a certain amount that you're allowed to raise the rents. For this year, it's 3.5%, always below inflation, of course, in this province. 3.5%, we don't know what it's going to be for next year. But what ended up happening with these landlords is they went to the Residential Tenancy Branch, and there is a process to be able to go to the tenancy branch and say that, I want to be able to raise rents further because something that I was, unforeseen, something that I reasonably couldn't see happened financially. And now I'm in a situation and I need to be able to raise rents a greater amount. And so what happened is these two landlords, they go to the RTB, and the RTB sides with the landlord and allows them to raise rents 23.5%. Now, they did say that that would have to be over a 2-year span, but now these tenants that, are paying $1,300, $1,500, that now jumps. That $1,500 is now about $2,000 that these landlords are allowed to charge. And this is obviously unprecedented. You don't hear of this happening. And often, this sort of process is used for capital expenditures. So if something happens that, you have a condo and God forbid, a huge piping disaster, needs repiping, needs exterior cladding, something that was unforeseen, came out of nowhere, you could go to the RTB and say, look, I need to go further than the 3.5% I'm allowed here. And in this instance, you have these multiplex landlords buying in 2021, again, at 1.90 rates. That variable rate, goes up into the sixes, like completely changes the scope of that investment. And I guess prior to going to the RTB, these landlords went to the tenants and they said, hey, we're in a pickle. Can we raise your rents? I think they said $500 each. And the tenants were like, no way, we'll give you $50. We'll give you $50. And so they went to the RTB. And in fact, I'm gonna read the ruling. I'm just gonna read a small piece of the ruling. I have it here in my phone because I think it's important. So they said, I find the landlord's evidence about incurring a financial loss for the financing costs of purchasing the residential property could not have been foreseen under reasonable circumstances credible. The landlords testified that they have always used a variable mortgage rate. Over the years, the variable rate has been stable, and it would be reasonable that the interest rate may increase by a few percent at renewal. The landlord stated that they did have a cushion to buffer in case of rate increases, but the rate increase in 2023 was substantial and quick. I find the landlords experienced dramatic interest rate increases, which may have made managing the property unsustainable. Now, do you think this opens up a can of worms? The whole premise behind that ruling says reasonable to expect that the rates were going to increase gradually, but not as they did. And if we take ourselves back, is it reasonable for a landlord or anyone to look at the Bank of Canada or the government encouraging spending, printing money, and saying, hey, rates are going to be low for a very long time? Is it reasonable to trust that? And I think it is. And so is this going to open up a can of worms for other landlords that want to go through that same process under the same pretense, having the same sort of issues? I think so. I've spoken with quite a few people, and this is catching a lot of notice, tons of notice. And in fact, Housing Minister Ravi Kahlon, came out with his response as well, of course. And his response so far is that, of course, they're going to look into it. They're going to review the policy. He was very clear that this is an old policy from an old government. This is not something that, this is not something we are for. That has already come out. And that this is going to turn into a political opportunity or a political play yet again. So I think, do not be surprised if we see some reform and change happen with the ability to be able to go to the RTB in excruciating circumstances and say, I had something unforeseen happen. I'd like to go a little bit further on the rental increase. Do not be surprised if this is used as another political play to say, we are here for you tenants. We're not here for you landlords. We're going to tighten this right up. And we're going to change this policy so it doesn't give any sort of breathing room for the landlords. This is what I expect to see, just based historically. But does this open up a can of worms? Absolutely. Are there thousands of other people out there sitting in a tough situation that have rental properties similar to these gentlemen, these landlords? Absolutely. Do they wish that they had solutions? Absolutely. So big story. We don't know at this point what the max allowable rental increase will be for next year. We're heading towards September. We should know by now. It's 3.5% this year. Going to be very interesting to see what they allow for next year. But man, this is a big story. This actually happened in May. The ruling, I guess, just came out. And so it's all over the place. You're probably going to hear about it online in news stories, but very big story. We're going to see what the province, how they are going to respond. I don't need to remind you, they're very quick to act legislatively, reform-wise when it comes to housing. Recently, they implemented the short-term rental new legislation where the property has to be your primary residence. They launched this in May. Does this actually have an effect on home prices? Well, very recently, we just received a Stats Canada report looking at short-term rentals across Canada and whether they actually impact the costs and the affordability of housing, both on the rental side and on the purchase side. And the data was pretty interesting. So basically, what they did was they looked at the short-term rental. Stats Canada, they used a company, AirDNA. AirDNA, they compile stats through VRBO, Airbnb, about short-term rentals and how they affect the market. And so basically what happened is Stats Canada looks at this piece of data and they say, okay, how do we let's determine which of these short-term rentals are actually potentially long-term dwellings. PTLDs. And they say, okay, so of all the short-term rentals, we're not going to count vacation properties. We're not going to count, the properties that are on a hill, cottage on a hill, or something along those lines, which couldn't really make long-term housing, a long-term housing solution for anyone. We're going to remove those out of the equation. We're going to look at these properties that were offered for rent for 180 days or more on these platforms. And so what they found right across Canada is about 100,000 units, and these of course are one-time units that could be added to long-term housing, whether that's rental, whether that's for sale. 100,000. And to give you a scope of what sort of drop in the bucket that is, that's less than 1% of Canada's total housing stock. Canada's total housing stock is about 15 million, just over 15 million. So 100,000, to give you a bit more of a perspective on that from an immigration perspective, when it comes to permanent residents, this country is welcoming in that 100,000 every 2.5 months or so. So in 2.5 months, that 100,000 is spent up, if you will, in terms of how many more people we're allowing into the country. So less than 1% of Canada's housing stock. So, even if you throw that into the market, you put that into the rental market, you put some of it into, it gets put on the market for sale, would have absolutely no impact on actual home prices. And again, it's a one-time thing. It's inventory gets absorbed, and we truck along. What has happened in BC when it comes to rent prices since May, when a whole bunch of rentals, furnished rentals, condo rentals were put back on the market because of short-term rental restrictions? We saw, rents stabilize. They dipped a little bit, but as per the last rental report that I reviewed, rents look like they're starting to climb back up. So these things get absorbed back into the market. But yet this was a huge political announcement that short-term rentals are killing affordability, and we're going to bring more homes for people. And really, it just hasn't done that, and it just doesn't have the effect that people may lead you to believe. But what has these restrictions on short-term rentals done in other areas? We're looking at Kelowna now, and Kelowna tourism down up to 50% this summer, and a huge chunk of that is because of hotel prices and because families finding it very unaffordable to find accommodations in these areas. And I spoke about this in last week's video, so I won't go too in depth with it, but we're going to start seeing more and more of these sort of challenges where businesses, under certain governments and in certain environments, businesses get hindered, and they get clamped down on by taxation and policies that make it very tough to be in the private sector and create jobs and fuel the economy, and the world as a business owner is just closing in on you. There's a new tax, there's a new legislation, a new tax, a new legislation, and it's just piling on. And ultimately what happens is this private sector, it contracts, and the public sector in the country, it grows. And you get to a point where, I was reading the other day, 25% of employed Canadians now work for the government, for the public sector. 25%. And we have the private sector struggling, not able to create more jobs. And the trickle-down effect of this, we don't see it today. We don't see it in 3 months. We start to see it in 6 months. We'll see it in a year. It's similar like interest rates. When interest rates started to climb, you don't instantly feel that. It takes time for that to move through the economy. So what's happening now with legislation and taxation, and let's restrict short-term rentals, and let's make it very difficult for the private entrepreneur or the private business owner to thrive. And here in Vancouver, tourism is down as well in a lot of areas, and it has to do with part of it has to do with these accommodations. Try and get your family out on a family vacation, and look at what it costs you to stay at a place in BC, a tourist destination, as it did in years past. And yes, everything has gone up, true, but that doesn't make it okay to make it more difficult to take that vacation, to bring the family out, because ultimately this affects businesses. Businesses shut down, businesses contract, we lose jobs. And again, we're not going to see the effect of this for quite some time. But circling this all back to what we were originally talking about, going to be very interesting to see what happens with this rental scenario. Expect this to be another political piece to latch onto. It's going to be interesting how they reform the ability for landlords to be able to apply for these excruciating circumstances for an additional increase, and of course finding out what we're going to be able to raise rents next year. So there you have it, guys. I hope you enjoyed this week's video. If you did, hit the like button, because what that does is it takes the video and it sends it out to more people so they can also learn from it. And if you enjoy this weekly real estate content, subscribe to this channel so you don't miss next week's video. And lastly, again, if you're in the Vancouver area or the Fraser Valley, you want to chat with me one-on-one about your real estate situation, you can book me for a free call, or just give me a call, shoot me a text, send me an email, whatever is easiest for you. I'd love to chat with you, but I want to thank you again for watching this week's video, and I look forward to seeing you next week.